Thank you for joining the CASL Webinar, Canada's anti-spam legislation. When CASL was unveiled at DGSI, we struck a committee. The internal committee included Damon Eng, our CFO, Blake Barge, our Director of IT, Andrea Saruk, our Marketing Manager, Andrea Ryan, Recruitment Manager for Design Group in Edmonton, as well as myself, Nicola Malcolm, Manager of Field Operations. On today's agenda, we will cover items such as what is CASL, sending commercial electronic messages. We will review things like special cases. We will talk a little bit about how DGSI is preparing for CASL, as well as show you some CASL resources on the Resource Center on StaffNet and some email templates that we have prepared in Bullhorn. We also will give you the background of how our job boards and LinkedIn are interpreting CASL and some resources and some question and answer period after the call. So what is CASL? CASL is an act to promote the efficiency and adaptability of the Canadian economy by regulating activities that discourage reliance on electronic means. In effect, CASL is an amendment to the CRTC, the Competition Act, the PIPEDA Act, and the Telecommunications Act. It came into effect on July the 1st, 2014, and CASL applies to all businesses in Canada who send commercial electronic messages to an electronic address. We're going to talk a little bit about what a commercial electronic message is, the definition of it, how we must include identification and an unsubscribe mechanism in any CEMs, as well as gathering consent, some exceptions and special cases surrounding CEMs. So a CEM is defined as a message whose purpose is to encourage participation in a commercial activity. By definition, it therefore excludes non-commercial activity, voice, fax, auto-recorded voice calls or robocalls, and broadcast messages on social media such as tweets and posts. Under CASL, an electronic address could be any of the following: an email account, an instant messaging account, a telephone account, and that is for the purposes of texting, as well as any similar social media account. What must be included in a CEM? So a commercial electronic message must clearly identify the sender. It must provide a method where the recipient can readily contact the sender. It also needs to provide a working unsubscribe mechanism that must be functional for at least 60 days at no cost to the recipient, and it must be easy to use and process without delay. And by that, the assumption is 10 business days. So how do we know if we have consent? There are two kinds of consent: express consent and implied consent, as defined under CASL. Under express consent, did the recipient say yes to receiving your CEM? And the individual must take action to opt in to a stated purpose. So for example, it is no longer acceptable for someone to have a website or a location where the opt-in is defaulted to yes. It needs to be an action to opt in on behalf of the recipient in a knowing fashion. Under implied consent, can you show that you have an existing business or non-business relationship with the recipient? Did the recipient disclose their address to you? And is it published? Is there a statement saying they don't wish to be contacted in any location where it is published? If so, then that denies the implied consent. So in order to be able to show that we have consent, we need to be able to show where we got each electronic address or email address. We need to track how we obtain the consent of each individual to whom we send CEMs. And just as a side note, a message sent seeking consent to send a CEM is also considered a CEM. So when is consent not required? There are certain circumstances where we do not need consent from the recipient. That is when we're providing a quote or an estimate, messages that facilitate or confirm transactions, messages surrounding warranties or recalls of products, when we're providing information about ongoing purchases of subscriptions, or when we're talking to the recipient about employment relationships or benefit plans, Also in situations such that we're delivering a product or service, including updates or upgrades. And the last one is most commonly used for IT software companies that are updating the information related to their good or service. Is my message exempt? So some messages under CASL are considered exempt. And these include if you have a personal relationship with the recipient, the individuals have a personal relationship. So, for example, we need to have proven direct, voluntary, two-way communication with that person, or if we have a family relationship with the recipient. And this, of course, would be something like a marriage, a common law partnership, or a parent-child relationship. In this case, we also have to show direct, voluntary, or two-way communication between both parties. This slide shows the information as it is defined under CASL for a personal relationship and a family relationship. And the piece I'd like to just review on this slide is under a personal relationship, such things as the frequency of communication previous to the CEM, the length of time the two parties have communicated and known each other, if they've met face-to-face. All of these things would help define whether we do or do not, in fact, have a personal relationship with the recipient, making the need for consent under CASL required. CASL does not apply to messages that are sent in the following situations: within or between businesses where there's an ongoing relationship, in response to a request, to enforce a legal right or obligation, or via a closed messaging system. And an example of that would be if you sign up to do business with a bank and you create an online banking account. That would be considered a closed messaging system because the only two people that are able to communicate through that forum would be yourself and the bank. Number 5 is to a foreign jurisdiction in compliance with their spam law, by registered charities raising funds, or by political candidates or organizations soliciting political contributions. So again, if our messages are related to any of these types of situations, they are exempt and they are not covered under CASL. Special cases. There are special cases defined under CASL that include unknown third parties. So in the picture that you're looking at right now, the person in the green t-shirt may have a relationship with a potential client in the blue t-shirt, and we would be acting as the agent or sender. So in this situation, the lady in the green t-shirt is going to give us a potential referral to the client. She has an existing relationship with them. She also has an existing relationship with us as the agent or sender. In that case, we may send one CEM and only one to the potential client, and that message also needs to have identification of who we are, as well as the unsubscribe requirements applied to the regular CASL CEM messages. In addition, on this following slide, the other piece that needs to be taken into account is that the CEM must include the full name of the individual who made the referral. So in the example we just used, the agent or sender would refer to the lady in the green t-shirt and say to the potential client, you know, this particular person has referred us to you, and you know, we would like to do business with you or have a discussion with you, and we would need to provide the name, full name and information of the referee or the lady in the green shirt, our information as to who we are, what our title is, and how we can be contacted, as well as an unsubscribe mechanism. And we can only send one CEM. When do we need to be ready? So CASL came into force on July the 1st, 2014. And after that time, we will need consent from any new client, and each CEM must include our ID and an unsubscribe mechanism. There are transitional provisions for this legislation, and we do continue to have implied consent to continue sending CEMs to existing contacts in our database for 3 years. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. So what are we doing to prepare? So in order to be ready for this legislation, we need to examine our messages, provide an ID and unsubscribe mechanism. We need to get clear express consent or implied consent to continue sending messages, as well as learning how to manage our contact list. So in going through the exercise with our internal committee, as well as talking to our legal counsel, all our messages have been deemed to be commercial electronic messages, and they are indeed covered by CASL. So that means that we need to provide an identification and unsubscribe mechanism. And as you can see, the email signature has been added by IT to all outgoing email of DGSI staff, and that actually came into being in the fall of 2013. So we already are doing a good job of providing identification and the unsubscribe mechanism. Now, the unsubscribe mechanism needs to be added to every CEM, and IT added this functionality to all outgoing messages effective July 1st of 2014. The important information to know about the unsubscribe in our emails is that if the recipient clicks on the unsubscribe link, that information updates their Bullhorn file, whether it be a candidate file or a client file. The Bullhorn consent to email status of no means that even if you send a candidate or client an email via Outlook, it'll be stopped by IT. However, in Bullhorn, there is no email blocking functionality, so you will need to check the consent field and manage accordingly. So just to be double sure on what we mean about this, some individuals use Outlook for email and others use Bullhorn for email. Bullhorn email will not stop an email from going through. So before sending an email with Bullhorn email, you need to check to make sure that the candidate or the client does not have the email status of no in their candidate profile or client profile. The other piece related to CASL is to be able to show consent, clear express consent or implied consent, and we will review that in the next coming slides. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that we are all clear on the fact that regardless of whether we always had express or implied consent, the moment one of our candidates or clients decides to unsubscribe, the unsubscribe trumps all previous implied or express consent. If a client or contact or candidate unsubscribes and we feel that they misunderstood the intent of the unsubscribe, then your next step would be to call them to discuss this over the phone, and we're not allowed to text or email them back after an unsubscribe because in fact then we would be sending a CEM without consent. So let's talk a little bit more about consent. So I'm going to review express consent for current candidates and new candidates. So for example, current candidates, how do we gather express consent? We have a CASL Resource Center where we have a number of tools where we can gather express consent through an email sign-up system. We also have a Bullhorn email template to gather express consent from our current candidates. And we can also obtain written consent and upload that information through the CASL site. So there are a number of different ways where we can gather current candidate express consent. I will show you some of those resources later on in the presentation. For new candidates, in terms of gathering express consent is where we've done the most work to change our processes to meet CASL. So we will be gathering express consent when the new candidate creates their profile on our website. We also will gather their express consent when they apply to a job on our website or through a job board. And we also will gather express consent on their application forms. So for Talent Core and IQ who use application forms, we will gather that consent there, and then we will scan and upload that consent page through the CASL Resource Center in order to change the Bullhorn flag to yes. We also have added express consent to the employee and contractor agreements for Design Group, Intecna, and Talent Core, and proof of that needs to be uploaded through the CASL Resource Center as well. So lots of different ways to gather that express consent for new candidates. So in terms of gathering express consent for current clients and new clients, similarly, we can gather express consent through the CASL Resource Center email sign up. And again, just to explain that a little bit further, there's a CASL Resource Center on StaffNet. And if you log on to it, you can pick whether the person that you're sending, the recipient that you're sending the email to is either a candidate or a client, and you can also pick the vertical that they belong to. You would simply enter their email address and click submit, and the recipient will receive a branded message tailored to them, whether they're a candidate or a client, and they will be able to give us express consent through that link. They would confirm, and that information would update their Bullhorn file. Again, we've also created Bullhorn email templates to gather express consent from our clients. And if you obtain written consent through any other manner, you can also upload that information through the CASL Resource Center. For new client contacts, after an initial conversation, be it on the phone or in person, we need to gather express consent, again through using the CASL Resource Center email sign-up. We can also gather the express consent through a Bullhorn email template, which we've prepared. Or if we get written consent in any other manner, we can upload that through the CASL Resource Center. We're going to move on to implied consent. So implied consent for current and new candidates. For current candidates, all candidates in Bullhorn that we have had direct voluntary two-way communication with, regardless of how long they've been in our database, have implied consent until July of 2017. All candidates with email addresses available on job boards, on LinkedIn, or on websites with no written request to not be contacted have given us implied consent to communicate with them. And again, implied consent is valid until July 2017 unless the candidates unsubscribe, in which case we can no longer communicate with them. For new candidates, if a candidate reaches out with a request for consideration or sends us a resume, that communication is not covered by CASL, but however, we do want to obtain express consent as soon as possible. So a couple of ways to make that really easy for our internal staff and our recruiters and account managers is to redirect any candidates, new candidates, to our website to create a profile, or we can send them a CASL Resource Center email sign-up, or provide them with an application form or employee or contractor agreement to collect their express consent. For new candidates, remember that we can also get a referral from a third party, and we're able to send them one email, and when they reply, we can gather their express consent as above. In terms of implied consent for current clients and current clients and new clients, all client contacts in Bullhorn that we have had direct voluntary two-way communication with and or have a current business relationship have given us implied consent. All client contacts with email addresses available on job boards, LinkedIn, and company websites with no written request not to be contacted have given us implied consent. And again, the implied consent lasts until July 2017 unless the client unsubscribes. The best practice here is to gather express consent whenever possible. For new client contacts, if a client contact reaches out to us with a request for service not covered by CASL, we still want to gather their express consent as soon as possible. So we would send them the CASL email sign-up form from the CASL Resource Center or the Bullhorn email template to gather that consent. If we have, again, a referral from a third party, we'd like to send one email, and hopefully when the new client contact replies, we gather express consent at that point. A best practice for all new client contacts is to prospect with them using the telephone first as a best practice, and to meet them in person so that we don't get any complaints around not complying with CASL legislation. I'm going to review unsubscribe now. So client contacts and candidates are managed in the same manner to unsubscribe. So our unsubscribe mechanism was added to all outgoing email signatures as of July the 1st, 2014. And what that means is underneath each signature, there's a link where the recipient can unsubscribe. By doing that, they update their actual contact profile or the candidate or client profile in Bullhorn, and their status email consent would be changed to no. We can also unsubscribe on behalf of a client that asks to be unsubscribed verbally, and we can do that through the CASL Resource Center using the unsubscribe button function, and you can see a screenshot of that on the slide that we're looking at right now. Again, I just wanted to remind you that making sure that the email consent status box in Bullhorn is either yes or blank or not responded before emailing. If the consent to email is set to no, then we are not to communicate with these client or candidate contacts. Continuing on our preparations for CASL, we need to make sure that we can demonstrate consent for every recipient, and I've described that in detail in the previous slides, and we'll review the actual sites more in detail in the coming slides. IT is taking care of this requirement for us. We also need to be able to act on unsubscribe requests, and again, we talked about how IT will manage the unsubscribe both through Outlook and Bullhorn emails and change the status in Bullhorn. Again, the Bullhorn client contact and candidate profiles will clearly show as below. Consent to email is either yes, no, or no response. And a fourth one has been added since this training went live, and that one includes no email address, and that is for contacts and candidate and client contacts with no email address in the system. So emails of those who are unsubscribed will be blocked when a design group employee tries to send one through Outlook, but not through Bullhorn. So if you're still using Bullhorn email, you need to make sure to check that status. This is a screenshot of what the consent to email field looks like in Bullhorn. And again, depending on the database that you're in, that consent to email may be further up or down on the right-hand side. However, you will notice that it's not a field that you can change manually. It must be changed or manipulated simply by going to the CASL Resource Center or by having the recipient click on one of the links available on the emails that are sent to them regarding CASL. This is a screenshot of the CASL Resource Center on StaffNet, and you will see here on the left-hand side, you can choose either a candidate or a client. You can choose a vertical. You would enter the email address of the recipient, and then you would click the Send Email button, and this allows the recipient to sign up for express consent to receive emails from our companies from all three verticals. The next section further down is written consent. So if we want to provide written consent and be able to show where it came from, this is where we would be able to upload a document. So for example, we would choose the email address of the candidate, and we would be able to upload a scanned copy of their application form as an example, or a CASL consent form to be able to change the consent email status in Bullhorn from no response to yes. And again, you would do that by entering the email address of the candidate, browsing your desktop to find the scanned copy of that document, and clicking consent. And that will change that field in Bullhorn for your candidate. The last one on the bottom is the unsubscribe, and this is the only place where we can unsubscribe for a client or a candidate who verbally calls us on the telephone, or we have a face-to-face and they expressly ask us not to continue to communicate with them. We would be able to enter their email address and click on the unsubscribe button, and that will change their consent to email status to no. On the right-hand side, you will notice that depending on your role in the organization and your login credentials, you will be able to see all of the client consents and candidate consents that you have received over time. So as you can see in this screenshot, this recruiter has 10 client consented profiles and 564 that have not responded. And on the candidate side, we have 60 express consented candidates and 2,172 that have not. If you hover over the plus signs under the consent columns, you are able to open up and see exactly who of all of your client and candidate contacts have and have not responded, so that you can work through those lists. And again, you can gather their express consent using the email sign up on the left-hand top. That's a very easy way to work through a list and get those out to your clients and candidates in a timely manner. This slide shows the CASL email templates in Bullhorn. This one happens to be one for Design Group. There are 3 versions: Design Group, Intechna, and Talentcore. And again, there are different ones based on the audience. So we encourage you to go in and look at and see Which ones we have created? We have created email templates for current clients, new clients, and current candidates. We did not create ones for new candidates because we handle them as we register and onboard them through our application process. We thought it would be interesting to talk to our job boards and to LinkedIn about how they viewed CASL, and we wanted to include this information just for your knowledge. So Career Builder, for example, decided to have all of their candidates and clients log in after July 1st and receive an express consent screen to ask them for their express consent the first time they logged in to their account after July the 1st. So that's how they're handling CASL. Monster decided to talk about CASL in terms of their job seeker policy. So they actually ask their job seekers to provide their consent to be contacted as soon as they create their profile online. And they asked us specifically to make sure that if and when a recruiter finds a resume, for example, on Monster, and perhaps the individual has forgotten to take it down and has since found employment, if we reach out to that person and they unsubscribe, Monster has asked all of our staffing suppliers, etc., staffing agencies, recruitment firms to honor that request to be unsubscribed. And of course, at Design Group Staffing Inc., we would be following and honoring that request. The last and most interesting, perhaps, is Workopolis, who have decided that because employers are contacting job seekers for employment, that CASL is not, does not in fact cover those types of communications. And they also cite the fact that the worker has conspicuously published their email address on their job board. So, in fact, they have provided implied consent for anybody to communicate with them, specifically regarding employment opportunities, by providing that email address publicly without a request to not be contacted. So Workopolis has interpreted CASL to basically not apply to the business that they do online. So what about LinkedIn? LinkedIn, when we asked them about their opinion on CASL, said that their members have and always have had the option to control the types of communications that they received, and they showed us where that would be available. So under the privacy and settings portion of their LinkedIn account, you can go to communications, types of messages you're willing to receive, and this is how LinkedIn is hoping that the people that are posting and creating profiles on LinkedIn will manage their personal requests to be contacted or not, depending on their requests that they save to their profile. So again, no changes in LinkedIn because of CASL. We wanted to provide you with the official CASL website. It's at fightspam.ca. This is their website as it exists today. We also wanted to allow all of our recruiters and account managers who want more information the ability to go on there and take a look at all of their resources. However, because we have an internal committee that has done substantial work on interpreting CASL as well as legal counsel, if you do have specific questions around CASL, we would hope that you would bring them to the committee or a member of the committee to have us interpret or look into your questions specifically as it relates to Design Group Staffing Inc. So we're always here and available to do that. So on the live webinar, we were able to have a short question and answer period, and that was followed by some closing thoughts, which I will provide now. So the closing thoughts are that we have implied consent for all candidates and clients in our database that we have done business with, or we have had two-way communication with that is voluntary. Our current candidates and clients have implied consent for 3 years to work at getting express consent. Something that happened in June of 2014 was that IT sent email blasts to all of our databases and was able to gather consent for some of our recruiters, clients, and candidates, and those results are the ones that you can see on the CASL dashboard today. New candidates covered with are covered by express consent if you use the current application forms and employee agreements. So we should make sure that we're not using agreements that are old or that have been saved to a desktop. We encourage you to go back to StaffNet and download the most recent versions. We also should be directing candidates to create a profile or apply to jobs on our website or online, and that way the express consent will be updated in Bullhorn. If new candidates do not drop into Bullhorn electronically, we need to upload a scanned copy of the written consent through the CASL Resource Center. Again, under this point, I just want to make sure that you don't confuse that with going to the candidate profile page and scanning a document and attaching it to their file. That does not result in a change to the Bullhorn consent to email status. So again, uploading a file to the candidate profile does not change the consent to email status. That only happens when you upload the document through the CASL Resource Center, as I showed you a few slides back. Our highest risk area is our new clients and prospects, so some best practices include meeting them in person, using the telephone, gathering express consent as soon as we can. We should not be harvesting random emails or guessing emails based on other contacts at a company. We should be using LinkedIn and continuing to use that as a good source for candidates. Remember the rule of only one commercial electronic message or CEM after a referral, and then we should be following up by phone or in person only. And the executive would like you to hear that CASL should not affect our ability to do business legitimately. We should be using common sense and follow best practices to mitigate risk. We have developed a DGSI CASL policy, and we will share it when it is ready. And depending on when you're listening to this webinar, it should be posted to StaffNet. Finally, new legislation is never easy to interpret. We've done the best that we can with the information and resources that we have available. As interpretation changes and the law is enforced, we will update our policies and procedure as it relates to CASL. And Andrea Ryan, who sits in our Edmonton Design Group office, has volunteered to answer questions that you may have. And this was offered for the live webinars. And that's at this point we would open the lines for questions and answers. However, if you're listening to this webinar at a different time, I remind you that we have some internal team members that would be happy to help, and I'll review their names. Those are Damon Ng, Blake Barge, Andrea Saruk, Andrea Ryan, and myself, Nicola Malcolm. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you have enough information to integrate Canada's anti-spam legislation into your everyday work at Design Group Staffing Inc. Thank you.